Okay, let me share my screen also. And where's that? Oh. I want to see that I'm sharing the screen correctly in YouTube live stream, and then I'll get started. Okay. Yeah. You can hear me well, I guess, right? My voice should be okay. And if it's not, I guess there's not much I can do right now. So again, hello, everyone. Welcome to this third meeting of PNS FPGA-based exploration of DRAM and RowHammer. In this meeting, in the live streamed part, I will present our recent work, an experimental analysis of RowHammer and HBM2 DRAM chips. So let me first explain the RowHammer vulnerability. This is a typical DRAM-based computing system with a CPU and a DRAM module. And we will look at a simplified depiction of this DRAM chip. This chip contains many rows. And in order to access data from a row, let's say row 2, the memory controller must first open or activate this row. And after all requests are serviced from this row, the memory controller must close this row, or we say pre-charge the row, in order to begin accessing data from another row. If you do this operation frequently, opening and closing the rows, due to an increase in cell-to-cell interference, this will result in bit flips in neighboring rows. And continuing to access this same row will induce even more failures in even more nearby rows. And this phenomenon is known as RowHammer. And we refer to this rapidly activated row as the aggressor row, and the rows where we observe the bit flips as victim rows. And a user-level program, like the one you see on the left, can induce these RowHammer bit flips in a similar way in main memory by running this access pattern that repeatedly activates DRAM rows. And prior work such as this one shows that RowHammer is a widespread phenomenon that affects almost all types of DRAM chips from various manufacturers in the field. And RowHammer is a problem mainly because the previous user-level program that accesses one memory location has unintended side effects on data that resides in memory. In other words, it breaks memory isolation. And memory isolation is a key property of reliable and secure computing systems. Many prior works, including this one, have shown that RowHammer can be used to take over systems. So I see someone in the waiting room. I'll just admit that. And let me also disable the waiting room quickly. Okay, cool. And many of the newer DRAM chips of different types are also vulnerable to RowHammer, as prior work demonstrated. And considering these recent developments in RowHammer, we ask the questions: what about new high bandwidth DRAM, DRAM memory? Does RowHammer exist in HBM chips or high bandwidth memory chips? And if so, how does the RowHammer vulnerability look like in these chips? And this is an executive summary of our work. HBM chips' new architectural characteristics that might affect the RowHammer vulnerability, and understanding RowHammer will enable us to design effective and efficient solutions. However, we see that no rigorous study demonstrates the RowHammer vulnerability in HBM, and our goal is to experimentally analyze how vulnerable HBM chips are to RowHammer. Therefore, we perform a detailed experimental characterization of RowHammer in a modern HBM2 DRAM chip, and we provide two main findings. First, we show that there is substantial variation in the RowHammer vulnerability in different physical locations of high bandwidth memory chips. For example, different channels in 3D stacked HBM chips exhibit different RowHammer vulnerability, and DRAM rows near the end of a DRAM bank are significantly more resilient to RowHammer than other DRAM rows. Second, we show that a modern DRAM chip, a modern HBM DRAM chip, implements undisclosed on-DRAM die RowHammer mitigation techniques. And we find that this particular mitigation mechanism Refresh is a victim row after every 17 periodic refresh operations. And this resembles a mitigation that prior found that exists in real DDR4 chips. So here's the outline of my talk. And I'll continue with HBM DRAM organization. So typical HBM2 DRAM system consists of a compute chip and multiple HBM2 DRAM chips. And all of these chips are integrated into a single package to form the HBM2 system. And here's a different view of the same system. The FPGA and the HBM chips reside in the same package and are connected by a silicon interposer. And the memory controller on the FPGA communicates with the buffer die in the 3D stacked DRAM chip over the HBM interface. The HBM2 chip contains multiple 3D stacked DRAM dies, and each DRAM die contains one or multiple DRAM channels. And finally, high-speed through-silicon vias connect the 3D stacked DRAM channels to the buffer die. Now let's look at what's inside a DRAM channel. And this is something you have seen in the past meeting. An HBM DRAM channel contains multiple pseudo channels, and each pseudo channel contains multiple banks. Each bank contains multiple subarrays, and subarrays have many rows. And inside a row, you will have many DRAM cells. So let's look at leakage in DRAM cells and RowHammer in more detail. Each DRAM cell encodes data in fundamentally leaky capacitors. And here's a simplified diagram of a DRAM cell where the capacitor in red stores the data, and the access transistor it determines when the cell is being accessed. There are a number of leakage paths by which the charge can enter or exit the cell, the capacitor. And the important thing to note is that the stored data can become corrupted if too much charge leaks, or which is the same as saying if the capacitor voltage degrades too much. And here we have a simplified diagram of the capacitor voltage over time. And we see that the voltage decreases over time in exponential decay. And there is a threshold Vmin under which we can no longer guarantee that we will correctly read the data back that we wrote to this DRAM cell. And as long as the cell's voltage remains above this line, we consider this a retention success, no failures. However, as soon as the voltage drops below Vmin, we consider this a retention failure, or there will be errors. And in order to prevent charge leakage failures, also known as retention failures, the memory controller periodically issues refresh operations to restore the charge in the cell. And the interval between the refresh commands, we refer to this interval as the refresh window. Now let's look at this diagram in the context of a RowHammer attack or a RowHammer access pattern. If enough activations are issued to a nearby row within a refresh window, the charge leakage rate can be accelerated to a point of failure, and subsequent refresh commands that you see here will now see this bit as if it was storing a 0 value instead of a 1 value that it originally stored. Now let me reiterate the problem that we're tackling in our work. No prior work rigorously studies the RowHammer vulnerability in high bandwidth memory chips, and our goal is to experimentally analyze how vulnerable real HBM chips are to RowHammer. I'll now introduce the testing methodology that we use in our experimental analysis, and it's similar to what you will use in this course. And our infrastructure is obviously based on the DRAM vendor DDR3 DRAM testing infrastructure. We adapt it to work with HBM2 chips. And here's a photo of our testing setup. We use this Bitware XUPVVH HBM2 FPGA board. We control the heating pad and the cooling fan using this Arduino temperature controller to keep the temperature of the testing setup stable. And this setup gives us fine-grained control over DRAM commands, and we can have as low as a 1.66 nanosecond delay between two consecutive DRAM commands that we issue to this DRAM chip. We carefully reuse the rigorous RowHammer characterization methodology described in prior work, where we prevent sources of interference and use the worst case double-sided RowHammer access pattern to characterize the DRAM chip. And we record the bit flips in the sandwich victim row. Our HBM2 chip contains 8 channels, 2 pseudo channels in each channel, 16 banks in each pseudo channel, and finally around 16,000 1 kilobyte large rows. We test all of the channels, pseudo channels, and banks, and we sample the first, middle, and last 3,000 rows in each bank to keep a reasonable experiment time, because testing more rows means you spend more time on your experiments. And we set the temperature controller's target temperature to 85 degrees Celsius. We measure 2 metrics in our experiments. The first one is the bit error rate, which is the fraction of DRAM cells that exhibit a RowHammer bit flip. So we activate the aggressor rows 512,000 times for this. We say that the RowHammer vulnerability worsens as this metric becomes higher. The second metric is the hammer count for the first bit flip. It's the number of aggressor row activations that's needed to induce the first bit flip on a victim row. And as this metric becomes smaller, it means that we need a shorter time and fewer activations to induce the first bit flip. Therefore, we can say that as the metric becomes lower, the RowHammer vulnerability becomes worse. We use the data patterns depicted in this table to initialize DRAM rows prior to performing RowHammer. And I'll explain how data gets laid out to the DRAM array based on this first row stripe 0 data pattern. So we will fill the victim row with all zeros, the aggressor rows with all ones, and the 7 other rows neighboring each aggressor row with all zeros. And here's another example showing what happens when we use the checkered 0 data pattern. And we use these 4 data patterns, and we determine the worst case data pattern for each tested DRAM row as the data pattern that causes the smallest HC first value or smallest number of aggressor row activations to induce the first bit flip. Right? And this data pattern can be any 4 of these, but it's not a different data pattern that we don't show you here. We have 2 main analyses in our study. First, we investigate how the RowHammer vulnerability changes across different HBM components in terms of bit error rate and the number of aggressor row activations to induce the first bit flip. And we investigate if the HBM2 chip implements an undisclosed RowHammer mitigation mechanism that might resemble the ones we have previously found in the DR4 chips. I'll start by sharing the results of our first analyses, starting with the 3 key takeaways that we make from this analysis. First, different 3D stacked HBM channels exhibit different RowHammer vulnerability. Second, DRAM rows near the end of a DRAM bank experience smaller bit error rate than other rows. And third, the activation count needed to induce the first bit flip changes with the data pattern and the physical location of the DRAM row. So I'll expand on these in the next slides. This figure depicts the RowHammer bit error rate distribution across all tested rows on the y-axis and the data patterns that we use on the x-axis. And different bars here show the distribution of bit error rate in different HBM2 DRAM channels. So just to explain this a bit further, there are basically multiple points here that this box is encapsulating per se. And each point represents the bit error rate of a DRAM row in a channel that we test. So for the blue colors, this means the first color, let's say the first box is for the first channel. Okay, so we make 2 observations from this figure. The first one is we observe bit flips in every tested DRAM row in all tested channels. And the second one is the bit error rate varies across channels. So you find that groups of 2 channels have different bit error rates compared to other groups that I show you here, for example. We see that the data pattern has an effect on the distribution of the bit error rate. And we see that our observations are consistent across different data patterns. And finally, I highlight the distributions we get for the worst case data patterns here. And we observe up to around 262 bit flips in a row of 8,000 bits with 512,000 activations. This plot shows the bit error rate on the y-axis, and this time the row address is on the x-axis, and different lines show the bit error rate for different channels. Note that we show only the last 3000 row addresses here, and the dashed vertical lines, these ones, indicate the reverse engineered subarray boundaries. And because we show only the last 3000 rows here, the first subarray on the left is not complete. We don't show it completely. It's cut off. We observe that the bit error rate is substantially smaller in the last 3000 rows that I highlight here. And this corresponds to the last subarray. We also see that the bit error rate goes up and down as we increase the row addresses. We see that the bit error rate is the highest in the middle of a reverse engineered subarray boundary, or a reverse engineered subarray, and it's lowest on either ends of the subarray. And we will explain this later in more detail. Now we show the same plot for the first and middle 3000 rows, and we see that our second observation is valid for all tested DRAM rows. Okay, now this plot shows the HC first distribution, the number of activation, the number of aggressor row activations to induce the first bit flip. So this RowHammer vulnerability becomes worse as we go down on the y-axis. And we show the different data patterns on the x-axis. We use different boxes to plot the distributions of HC first for different channels. We observe that HC first is as low as around 14,000 across all rows we've tested. And this means that we can induce a bit flip in only around 1 milliseconds if we have access to this low-level interface. That meaning we can send issue, activate, and precharge commands at the highest possible rate. We see that the HC first distribution depends heavily on the data pattern that we use to initialize DRAM rows also. We also investigate the variation in bit error rate across rows in each bank, but I'll skip this because it's a rather complicated plot to explain. But if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them later. So we formed two key hypotheses from our study. First, we attribute the similarity in bit error rate and HC first within groups of two channels, such as the ones that I highlighted here, to their physical placement inside the HBM chip. We think that these groups of two channels share the same DRAM die. So I've shown you the 3D stacked architecture of HBM2 chips. Basically, we think that these groups of two channels reside in the same layer. And second, the RowHammer bit error rate changes with the row's proximity to sense amplifiers. We think that the significant drop in this bit error rate in the last subarray can be due to the subarray's proximity to bank I/O logic, meaning that it resides closer to circuitry that's basically believed to be, at least, produced using a different technology than what you use to produce DRAM arrays at a very high level. Okay, this is the main observation from our study, right? RowHammer bit error rate and HC first varies across channels. And you find that this has two key implications for RowHammer attacks and mitigations. Mitigations as in RowHammer defense techniques that prevent bit flips. First, attacks can use the most vulnerable channels to accelerate their preparation and attack phases. So they can identify DRAM rows to attack faster if they specify, if they specifically target the worst RowHammer vulnerable channel. And this allows the attacker to take over vulnerable systems more quickly. And second, mitigations can allocate fewer resources to protect RowHammer resilient channels and more resources to protect RowHammer vulnerable channels. Now, resources are typically expressed in terms of, for example, you need to count how many activations each DRAM row receives. And that means you need to implement a few or many counters, hardware counters. And basically, the defense can implement fewer of these counters for channels that it thinks are more RowHammer resilient, and it can instead implement those counters for channels that that are less resilient to RowHammer. So this can improve the efficiency of RowHammer mitigation mechanisms. Okay, I'll stop here to take any questions that you might have or that we might have on YouTube. So I see one question in Zoom and one on YouTube. So I'll start with the Zoom one. If given a row V, are the two adjacent rows always V plus minus one? That's a good question. And that's, I think, one of the PNS projects is to understand this in more detail, right? So that's not the case always. There is what we call in DRAM address mappings that manufacturers use for various reasons. But the end result is, if you have a logical DRAM row, this DRAM row address that's exposed to your memory controller through the signals that go out of the DDR interface or HBM interface, that's a logical DRAM row. Let's say you drive that signal with 0, then it's not guaranteed that logical address 1 will reside next to it physically. The DRAM row that corresponds to that logical address won't necessarily reside next to logical row 0 inside the chip. So you don't always know that. But we have ways to reverse engineer that. And our main means of doing that is to perform RowHammer attacks, actually, kind of sort of a, I would say chicken and egg, but maybe that's not a good way to say it. But basically, we do RowHammer first, single-sided RowHammer attacks, right? To if you hammer a row, just one row, we know that the neighboring rows will have the most bit flips, the immediate neighbors. So what we do is we hammer one row, let's say logical row 0, and then we read out all other rows in the bank. We record the rows, logical rows again, that have bit flips, and now we have a way to work out that address mapping function, right? Because we know which logical rows reside next to each other physically. And then we can figure out the logical to physical address mapping that way. But the underlying assumption is, which I think is correct, it's not proven to be false yet. If you hammer a row, you will induce bit flips in the immediate neighbors, or the most bit flips in the immediate neighbors, and not some random row somewhere else. Okay, let me know if that answers or doesn't answer your question, Ludwig. And in YouTube chat, we have, will error correction enabled, sorry, I cannot read it completely. Will ECC enabled DRAM be affected? Yeah, so that's another good question, right? So we have error correcting codes in many systems today that are there to prevent these sorts of bit flips. But they're targeting different error mechanisms, I would say. So first, what they are built for usually is errors that might randomly occur, right? Like soft errors, other sort of errors, not necessarily these RowHammer errors that an attacker can inflict at a very high bit error rate in a very targeted manner. What that means is, like as an example, you don't expect soft errors to happen, many soft errors to happen at once in a very small DRAM region. By DRAM region, I mean in multiple neighboring bits in the same row. But RowHammer bit flips can happen that way. So when that happens, your ECC cannot correct those bit flips because there are too many bit flips for the ECCs that exceeds the ECC's capabilities, basically. And if you want to match your ECC capabilities to be able to protect these, prevent these sort of bit flips, then you have to, then it's costly in terms of additional storage overhead. That's pretty much, and I guess the shorter answer is ECC is useful still, but it won't completely solve the problem. And for more quantitative analysis, I think I am not sure if this is correct, but we might have it in the Revisiting RowHammer paper, or uncovering TRR. I don't know if any of the TAs could check and put. I think we have it in uncovering TRR paper, an analysis on error or number of bit flips per cache block that relates to ECC's correction capabilities, basically. So it was a long answer, but yeah, hopefully it was useful. And if no one pastes a link to that, I will do it at the end of the presentation. Okay, now I'll continue. This is our second analysis on DRAM RowHammer, on DRAM die RowHammer mitigations. So these are the two key takeaways from our second analysis. First, the chip we test implements an undisclosed on-DRAM die RowHammer mitigation mechanism, and this mitigation mechanism resembles the ones prior work has found in real DDR4 chips. So I'll explain what these means. The HBM2 standard defines a target row refresh mode where the controller and the HBM2 chip cooperates to prevent RowHammer bit flips. Basically, the memory controller sends a specialized sequence of commands, and it has to wait for some time when the memory controller detects an ongoing RowHammer attack. Again, a very high-level description. It's not exactly like this. That's what I mean by cooperating with the DRAM chip. And basically, the existence of this is documented in the standard. This is a known mechanism. However, we also know that real DDR4 chips implement on-die mitigation mechanisms that take actions in a memory controller transparent way. And these actions typically are hidden behind the latency of a periodic refresh operation. So in DDR4 chips, there's no documented TRR, right? We don't know how TRR operates or functions, but we know it exists from many prior work. Now we want to understand if a similar hidden mitigation mechanism exists in our HBM2 DRAM chip. And we use the methodology that was presented in this paper, where the key idea is to use data retention failures as a side channel to detect when a row is refreshed by the on-die mitigation mechanism. And we reuse the source code that's publicly available on this GitHub page for our analysis. Now I'll expand on the key idea. So this is the methodology that we use. We first find a DRAM row, let's say row R, with a retention time of T. This means that the row will exhibit retention failures if we do not refresh it for a T amount of time, T units of time. And on the bottom, we have a timeline of actions taken by us, the tester, and actions taken by the currently hypothetical hidden on DRAM die RowHammer mitigation mechanism. And at the beginning of this timeline, we refresh row R so that it can retain data until we spend a T units of time. And then we wait for half T. We will activate and pre-charge R+1 once. This is our aggressor row. And let's now look at what a hypothetical mitigation mechanism will do. It will sample this activation of R+1 as an aggressor row activation. And then we will issue a periodic refresh command to trigger this mitigation mechanism. And if the mitigation has sampled this R+1 as an aggressor row, it will refresh the victim row R. And we then wait for half T again, read out row R, and we check for bit flips in row R. Now, row R will not experience any bit flips if the DRAM die mitigation exists and it has refreshed R at half T, right? Otherwise, row R will experience retention bit flips because we didn't refresh it for T units of time. So we're relying on the TRR mechanism to refresh the row. And if the row is not refreshed, we will see bit flips. And if we don't see any bit flip, that means something has refreshed the row. And that is the TRR mechanism. So we performed this experiment and find that the HBM2 chip implements an undisclosed on-die mitigation mechanism. This mechanism performs a victim row refresh operation after every 17 periodic refresh operations. And this resembles a TR mechanism that a real DDR4 chip implemented. And we want to uncover more about the inner workings of this mechanism as part of our future work. So I'll conclude my talk with a summary. We provide the first detailed experimental characterization of RowHammer in a modern HBM2 DRAM chip, and we find that different channels exhibit different levels of vulnerability. DRAM rows near the end of the DRAM bank are more resilient, and these findings can be leveraged to develop more powerful attacks and more efficient defenses. We identify an on-die RowHammer mitigation mechanism in HBM2 chips, and this mechanism resembles the ones we have found in DDR4 chips. And to present more insights into RowHammer's behavior in high bandwidth memory, we plan to test more chips and more data patterns at different temperatures and voltage levels, investigate the effects of read disturbance across 3D stacked channels. That's like a very ambitious, let's say, study that we plan to do, but let's see. And finally, study the effects of new read disturb phenomena, such as row press that was, I guess, recently presented at ISCA. And a version of our conference paper is available on arXiv at this link. And also you can use the QR code to reach our paper. Yeah. So this is all. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take your questions now if you have any more. And I am checking YouTube to see a follow-up on the ECC question. I think you will do a burst error. I think terminology-wise, I don't know what a burst error is, but I would say if it means like inducing errors in a very small region, yes, many errors in a small region, I think that's what you end up doing with RowHammer. Again, comparative. Again, this is sort of compared to what you expect from soft error patterns, right? Compared to soft errors, RowHammer errors will be more bursty, I think. Okay. And anything on Zoom? There's one chat message. Okay, it's a very long one. A general question regarding DRAM. I think we can take that in the second half, where when I stop the live stream and we go back to our course and basically what we would do normally in a weekly update meeting. So I'll just transition the course to that by stopping the live stream now. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining this live stream, and if you have more questions, feel free to follow up, or basically feel free to write comments in the YouTube video and I'll check and respond to them. Goodbye.